Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Things are pretty tense right now with everything going on in Ukraine. And on top of that, we have a new administration coming into the White House.
Yeah, it's certainly a critical moment, and there's a lot to unpack.
Exactly. So today we're going to be looking at two sources to help us understand the situation a bit better. First, we have a recent article from Military Review magazine that gives a really on-the-ground perspective of how the conflict is escalating. And then we'll be looking at an opinion piece from the Cato Institute, which examines how U.S. foreign policy might change under the new Trump administration.
It's really interesting how these two pieces connect, because the escalation on the ground is already sparking all sorts of reactions internationally, and that's sure to influence how the U.S. approaches things.
Right. What's really striking about that Military Review piece is the sheer scale of Russia's response to the Ukrainian attacks. They've launched these massive strikes targeting critical infrastructure across the country.
Yeah, they've hit regions like Khmelnytsky and Vinnytsia, just to name a couple. And the result is that we're seeing widespread power outages in places like Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk.
It's a pretty clear message from Moscow that they're not backing down.
Absolutely. They're playing hardball here. And the article highlights that the destruction of gas infrastructure and even potentially some Western-supplied missile systems. This is high-stakes stuff.
Yeah, no kidding. It really raises the question of what the West's response is going to be. I mean, how do you counter that kind of aggression?
Well, that's what everyone's trying to figure out right now. And the article points out that this isn't just a military challenge. It's a huge political problem for Western governments as well, because the economic burden of supporting Ukraine is starting to cause a lot of discontent among their own citizens.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The article mentioned Germany, Colombia, and Australia specifically.
Yeah.
It seems like leaders are walking a tightrope between supporting Ukraine and keeping their own populations on board.
Right. And then you have the growing calls for negotiations, but it's hard to see how that's even realistic at this point. The article quotes NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who says it's becoming increasingly difficult to negotiate with Moscow from a position of strength, especially given that Russia is ramping up arms production while Ukraine is suffering losses on the battlefield.
So you'd think that would push Ukraine towards the negotiating table, but they're still launching those long-range missile strikes into Russian territory.
Yeah, and that's the risky part. While those strikes might achieve some tactical gains in the short term, the article argues that they also risk further escalation and could ultimately harm Ukraine more than they help.
I could see that. I mean, just imagine the damage to their already struggling economy and infrastructure.
Exactly. It's a real dilemma for Ukraine.
So we've got this incredibly tense situation in Ukraine, escalating conflict, weakening Western support, a push for negotiations, even as the fighting continues. Now let's turn to that Cato Institute article and see what they have to say about how all of this might play out under a Trump administration.
This article is going to be particularly interesting because it takes a very critical look at the current U.S. foreign policy landscape. The author argues that despite the change in administration, we're unlikely to see less U.S. involvement globally, just a change in how that involvement looks. And they're not exactly singing Biden's praises, especially when it comes to his track record in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
Yeah, they really go after Biden's approach in Europe, specifically his role in NATO expansion. They argue that it's actually a contributing factor to the conflict in Ukraine. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but they back it up with some historical context. They point to what they see as broken promises made to Russia about NATO expansion after the Cold War. Assurances that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. In their view, these unkept promises played a role in creating the conditions for the current crisis.
So they're basically suggesting that there's this chain of events, each action leading to the next, and that ultimately led to the current situation.
Exactly. And that's why they advocate for a pretty radical shift in approach. They argue for encouraging European self-reliance in defense matters and a gradual withdrawal of U.S. forces. They even suggest setting a date for handing over European security responsibilities.
That's a pretty big departure from the status quo.
Yeah.
So they're critical of Biden's handling of Europe. But what about the Middle East? It's a region with a long and complicated history of U.S. involvement. What's their take on that?
Well, they're not holding back there either. They actually claim that U.S. policy in the Middle East has been even more misguided than in Europe, which is saying something. They specifically criticize past interventions like the Iraq War and what they see as this persistent tendency for the U.S. to act as the indispensable power in the region.
Okay, but what specific examples do they give to support that argument? It's one thing to make these sweeping generalizations, but I'm curious about their specific criticisms.
Well, for one, they highlight the ongoing U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And they're also critical of what they see as the Biden administration prioritizing Israeli and Saudi interests over those of the American people. It's a pretty harsh assessment.
Yeah, it sounds like this author really believes that the U.S. is entangled in too many conflicts that don't directly serve its interests. Okay, so we've covered Europe and the Middle East, but what about Asia? What's their perspective on U.S. policy in that region?
They express a lot of concern about U.S. commitments in Asia, particularly the potential for getting dragged into a conflict with nuclear-armed North Korea or China. They see the U.S. military presence in the region as a potential flashpoint for a much larger, even catastrophic conflict.
So essentially, they're making the same argument about Asia that they made about the Middle East, that the U.S. is overextended.
Exactly. They're calling for a less interventionist approach across the board, encouraging greater self-sufficiency among U.S. allies in Asia, particularly on the Korean Peninsula. And they're especially concerned about Taiwan, arguing that the U.S. has no vital interest in defending it against China, and that Biden's pledges to do so are reckless and potentially disastrous.
So there's definitely a consistent theme emerging here. They're calling for a more restrained U.S. foreign policy, questioning the assumptions driving current policy, and calling for a reassessment of what truly serves U.S. interests. It's a pretty provocative argument.
It is. It really challenges the prevailing view of the U.S. as the world's policeman. It's going to be interesting to see how much traction this perspective gains, especially as a new administration takes office.
It's definitely food for thought. We've got a lot to unpack here, from the escalating situation in Ukraine to the potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy and what that might mean for different regions of the world. But let's take a pause here. We'll dive deeper into the potential implications of all of this in part 2 of our deep dive.
Picking up where we left off, it's important to remember that the Cato Institute article presents just one perspective among many. There are other voices in the foreign policy arena who see things quite differently and advocate for different approaches.
All right, of course. Not everyone agrees with that more isolationist approach. What are some of the alternative perspectives out there?
Well, some argue that a more assertive U.S. foreign policy is necessary to counter the growing influence of countries like Russia and China. They might see pulling back from global commitments as a sign of weakness, potentially emboldening those rivals, and ultimately creating instability in the international order.
So it's a balancing act then. Being engaged in global affairs, but not overextending to the point where it harms our own interests.
Exactly. It's a complex calculation. And that's where critical thinking comes in. As you process all this information, think about the potential consequences of different policy choices. What are the risks and benefits of a more interventionist approach versus a more restrained one? There are no easy answers.
It's like a giant game of chess, isn't it? Where every move has these ripple effects across the whole board. Speaking of strategic moves, let's circle back to the situation in Ukraine for a moment. We've got Russia making advances, rowing calls for negotiation, but also continued fighting. What are some of the potential scenarios that could unfold from here?
Well, one possibility is that Ukraine, under pressure from the mounting losses and perhaps facing waning Western support, agrees to negotiate with Russia. This could lead to a settlement involving territorial concessions from Ukraine in exchange for a ceasefire and security guarantees.
That would be a tough pill to swallow for Ukraine, wouldn't it? Giving up territory after fighting so hard to defend it. I wonder what the response from the Ukrainian people would be.
It would definitely be deeply unpopular, but for Ukraine's leadership, it might come down to weighing the immense cost of continued fighting against the potential benefits of peace, even if it means accepting a painful compromise.
And what about the international community? What role would they play in all of this?
The international community, especially Western powers, would likely be heavily involved, acting as mediators and potentially providing guarantees for any agreement reached. Their involvement would be crucial in trying to ensure a lasting peace and prevent the conflict from reigniting.
But we've already seen some cracks in international unity, with countries like Germany facing that internal pressure over their support for Ukraine. Could that complicate things?
Absolutely. If Western unity weakens, it could diminish their leverage in negotiations and embolden Russia to take a harder line.
So a negotiated settlement, even if it's difficult, at least offers a path towards ending the bloodshed. Are there other scenarios we should be considering, perhaps less optimistic ones?
Of course. Another possibility, and this is a very concerning one, is that the conflict continues to escalate with neither side willing to back down. This could lead to a protracted war of attrition with devastating consequences for Ukraine and potentially spilling over into neighboring countries and further destabilizing the entire region.
A wider war. Wow, that's a chilling thought. What could trigger that kind of escalation? Is it just a matter of the fighting continuing, or are there specific actions that could dramatically raise the stakes?
There are several potential triggers. A miscalculation or an accident could quickly spiral out of control. For instance, a stray missile hitting a NATO member state. That could trigger Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which considers an attack on one member an attack on all, leading to a direct military confrontation between Russia and NATO.
Okay, that's a nightmare scenario. And with tensions already so high, it's not hard to imagine how quickly things could escalate beyond anyone's control.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these potential scenarios, even the worst case ones, is so essential. It allows us to anticipate risks, assess potential consequences, and think critically about the choices leaders are making.
So we've got those two major scenarios, a negotiated settlement, however difficult, and a continued escalation with that terrifying risk of a wider war. Are there any other possibilities? Perhaps something a little less predictable?
There's always the wild card scenario, the unexpected event that throws everyone's calculations off. It's impossible to predict these with any certainty. But history teaches us that the future rarely unfolds in a linear, predictable way.
That's a humbling thought. No matter how much we analyze and try to anticipate, there's always that potential for something totally unexpected to happen. You know, something that really reminds us just how fragile peace and stability can be.
Absolutely. And that fragility underscores the importance of diplomacy, clear communication, and however difficult it may seem at times, the willingness to find common ground.
So much hinges on the decisions leaders make in the coming weeks and months, not just for the immediate future of the conflict itself, but also for the broader trajectory of U.S. foreign policy and the stability of the global order.
And that's where informed citizens like yourself play a crucial role. By understanding the complexities, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and holding leaders accountable, you can contribute to shaping a more peaceful and secure world.
It's not enough to be a passive observer. We need to be active participants in these crucial conversations. We need to use our knowledge to advocate for policies that promote peace and global stability.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the Cato Institute article and its critique of U.S. foreign policy. It's crucial to consider not only the potential consequences of the conflict in Ukraine, but also how those consequences might ripple outwards, impacting other regions and potentially drawing the U.S. into further conflicts.
The author argues that the U.S. needs to be more selective in its foreign interventions and really focus on its core national interest. They suggest that we've become too entangled in conflicts that don't directly threaten our security, and that this overextension weakens our global standing.
It's a challenging perspective that questions the traditional view of the U.S. as the world's indispensable nation. You know, the one that must always step in to solve global problems. They advocate for a more restrained approach, recognizing the limits of U.S. power and the importance of prioritizing our own interests.
It raises the question of where to draw the line. When is it appropriate for the U.S. to intervene in a foreign conflict? And when should we step back and allow other countries to take the lead? How do we define those vital interests and balance them against our global responsibilities?
It's a complex calculation with no easy answers, but it's a debate that needs our attention, especially as the U.S. navigates a rapidly changing global landscape with new challenges and potential adversaries emerging.
It seems like the next few years will be a defining period for U.S. foreign policy. We can see significant shifts in approach and priorities. I wonder what that will mean for our role in the world.
Indeed, this is a conversation that requires your thoughtful engagement. What role do you believe the U.S. should play in the world? What are its vital interests, and how should it balance those interests with its global responsibilities? These are big questions that deserve our attention.
There are no easy answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions. But it's through these kinds of informed discussions and debates that we can try to find the best course of action for our country and for the world.
And as you grapple with these questions, consider the contrasting viewpoints presented in our two sources. The Military Review article provides that on-the-ground perspective of a conflict that's reshaping the geopolitical landscape, while the Cato Institute piece offers a critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy and potential future directions. It's the interplay of these perspectives that will shape the future of global affairs.
You know, it's really interesting how these two sources offer such different lenses through which to view the situation.
Yeah, one pulls you right into the immediacy of the conflict, and the other really encourages you to zoom out and think about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? Equip you with the knowledge and the different perspectives you need to make sense of it all. But it feels like we've only scratched the surface here. What are some of the other global trends we should be paying attention to as we try to make sense of everything that's going on?
Well, you're right. The situation in Ukraine and the potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of this much larger web of global trends and challenges. You know, for instance, we can't ignore the rise of nationalism and populism that we're seeing in various parts of the world.
Yeah, that's definitely been a major trend in recent years. Yeah. But we've already seen how those sentiments have influenced the conflict both within Russia and in some Western countries. But how could this broader trend affect things moving forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How will these forces influence the decisions of leaders, and how will they shape the trajectory of international relations in the years to come? What will it mean for the US's ability to maintain its global alliances and partnerships, which are, essential for tackling those big shared challenges like climate change, pandemics, and economic instability?
It's like you're painting this picture of a world where everything is interconnected, where events in one place can trigger a whole cascade of consequences across the globe.
And that's exactly why it's so important to stay informed, to understand the complexities of these issues, and to engage in thoughtful dialogue with others.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about what's happening over there in some far off country. It's about understanding how these global events impact our own lives, our communities, and our future.
Exactly. By understanding those connections, you can become a more informed and engaged citizen, someone who can contribute to creating a world that is more peaceful, just, and sustainable.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the escalating situation in Ukraine and the potential shifts in U.S. foreign policy, we want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. What role do you want to play in shaping the future?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, because the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we create through our choices and our actions.
And those choices are shaped by our understanding of the world, the information we consume, and the perspectives we choose to embrace. So keep learning, keep questioning, keep engaging, and be the change you want to see in the world.